Hi, everybody. My name is Grace Lordan. There's a couple of things I'd like you to know about me before I start so you understand why I'm standing here. So I'm not in talent acquisition. I'm not a recruiter, but I work with very large organizations about how they can rethink their skills inside the organizations to make the organizations more productive. And I'm going to show you a bunch of data today that I think will tell you quite an optimistic story about what might be possible with artificial intelligence. But I think it needs humans to have some intervention in order for us to get there. The second thing is, if you Google me, you'll see that I wrote a book called Think Big. If you're interested in careers, please do check it out. But I want to say it's not the book that Donald Trump wrote. So people send me messages after I talk and they say, did you ghostwrite his book? No, it's its own individual book. And the third, if you look on the slide, by now you might have looked at a black and white picture as you kind of tuned in and tuned out of what I was saying, and you might have made a decision that you can see a duck on the slide. So hopefully some people in the audience can see a duck. Some people are saying no, so I'm guessing you can see a rabbit. And hopefully now that I've told you that some of you are seeing a duck and some of you are seeing a rabbit, you can see both the duck and the rabbit. If you looked at the slide and saw both instantaneously, I can tell you from research that you're creative. If you looked at the slide and can still see neither, I can't help you because I'm not a doctor. But today I'm going to talk to you about the human advantage, and I think I'm going to present this to you as a case. And I'm going to talk a little bit about one specific company that I've known now for a year and where they were when I met them on their journey a year ago. I met their CTO, John. But I'm also going to show you some data that tells you that this isn't an unusual company for the state that they're in. So sometimes people like me come and have conversations with them, and they might try to pivot their strategy. But I think the recruiter is much more poised than me. There's many more of you, but also you're at the coalface of hiring new talent. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the type of talent that organizations are hiring now who are doing incredibly well with AI. And what I mean by well with AI is that they haven't decreased their hiring. They're hiring more than they did last year, but they are having big growth and big productivity returns. I'm going to call the company, because they've told me that I cannot name them legally, and they do have a legal department, U-Turn Industries. And I'm going to call the CTO called John. I've chosen the name John very randomly. I've chosen the name U-Turn Industries thinking about the British government that keeps seeming to change its mind. And U-Turn Industries really reminded me of this. So when I met U-Turn Industries 1 year ago, I met the CTO, John, and he was really frustrated. They had invested millions of pounds in artificial intelligence. They weren't seeing the gains from artificial intelligence. They had a big objective that they would cut costs inside in the business from artificial intelligence, and they weren't seeing the costs being reduced. But they were seeing changes to their talent. And for the first time in my career, I became interested in the people who had recently left the organization, or people who I heard might be thinking about leaving the organization. And there's three people that I'll mention because I think they're archetypes of what was going on in U-Turn Industries. So the first person was Denise. So Denise had been with the organization about 11 years, and nobody really knew what Denise did. Denise, in fact, was able to tell if a client was going to leave the organization without the client actually saying anything. She knew those clients so well. Denise also knew why some numbers didn't add up and why some functions were performing less well than others. Denise wasn't somebody who complained, and in fact, she didn't complain at all, and she left very quietly one Tuesday when she handed in her notice and said she was going to take all the holidays that she had accrued. And it was when they left, they noticed that this was somebody who should have been retained inside the organization. The second person is Marcus, who I did get to speak to. Marcus, 62 years of age, was the best salesperson in U-Turn Industries. When the AI was rolled out by John, the CTO, they wanted to make some people redundant because they wanted to have some instant costs. And because of his age being 62, John was offered redundancy. And John was so insulted about being offered redundancy, in his own words, that he took it. And he said he went to the Maldives with his wife, this holiday they'd wanted to take for an incredibly long time. And he was miserable every moment of it because he was thinking of the organization he'd given so much time to and how they treated him. And the last person is Priya. So Priya was only in the organization 18 months. Again, Priya is somebody that I got to talk to. Priya knew a lot about artificial intelligence. She knew a lot about job design. She knew a lot about skills. She knew a lot about productivity. And the AI strategy landed on Priya. She had no input into it. She tried to work with it for a while, but she left then for a startup where she could actually build something from the ground up. And if you looked at the talent of U-Turn Industries when I met them, they had reduced their headcount by a very, very small amount. The people who they were hiring definitely couldn't replace Denise, Marcus, and Priya. It was definitely low-quality hires that they were getting because people knew that this was a company who had an AI strategy, that they wanted to cut costs, and they weren't involving their employees. And the one thing that I want to convince you in the talk today is U-Turn Industries, when I met them, they didn't have a technology problem. They actually had the most state-of-the-art technology. They had training that you go to on your lunch break or on your weekends if you wanted to get trained, but they weren't encouraging people to access that training. They also hadn't thought about training being generic versus being specific, and they'd rolled out this generic training that didn't speak to employees like Marcus. It didn't speak to employees like Denise. And I'm going to try to show you this in 3 ways, and I'm going to try to convince you that U-Turn Industries isn't unique. I've met a lot of organizations like U-Turn Industries since. And I'm going to talk firstly about the transformation gap. Secondly, I'm going to talk about AI training, what we're spending on it, who's getting it, and why we might want to rethink our strategy. And the third is I really want to talk about not forgetting the human being. The most important thing, though, that I think you can take away today is people often ask me, is AI going to take our jobs? Are we going to have less jobs in the economy as compared to AI? Right now, this is a human decision. It's being decided inside organizations. It's being decided by governments, by their policies. This isn't decided by the technology itself. So we can have the same outcome with many more jobs, better jobs for the UK, or we can have an outcome where the UK has lower quality jobs and lower levels of jobs, but it is decided by human beings. So the first thing I'll talk about is the transformation gap. So everyone knows that adoption of artificial intelligence is absolutely everywhere. What might be less clear is that value is actually quite rare. So the first problem in organizations that I work with is the big objective that they set when they take on artificial intelligence is they actually want to reduce costs. So they will say, by the end of year 1, we want to reduce costs by X%. There's no mention of innovation, there's no mention of productivity. So what we're trying to do, if we're saying we want to reduce costs, is get the machine to substitute for the human. Because of that, we see 39% of organizations reporting any profits because of artificial intelligence. And in fact, for 94% of organizations, the profits that they're reporting are actually quite low at the moment. The second problem that we have is that most organizations are using AI only at the surface. So I get to choose right now in my employer how I use artificial intelligence, the task that it replaces for me. And this is common whether I work in finance organizations, technology organizations, pharmaceutical organizations. The pattern is the same. We self-serve when it comes to artificial intelligence. And this is problematic because only 20% are actually growing their revenue because of AI. Now, what's more interesting, if we look at the numbers of the high-growth industries, there are 6% of organizations who've managed to get growth of more than 5% because of artificial intelligence. And they do a few things differently. If I was to pick one, they redesign work and they bring their people along for the journey. And these organizations, they may have an objective on cost, but they also have an objective on transformational change. And when we think of transformational change and we think of growth, that's where we get the larger headcount inside organizations. These are organizations that are redesigning workplaces alongside their colleagues. If I had been in U-Turn Industries sooner, Denise would have redesigned her job alongside U-Turn Industries as one of their best employees. When I looked at the different type of things that's been saying about recruiters and talent acquisition, you can see lots of articles that talk about artificial intelligence coming for the recruiter. And I can safely say this is not the case. For me, I see recruiters as the architects of transformation. So not only are you the people who help organizations acquire talent, but you can also nudge organizations to look for specific types of talent. And I'm going to talk to you about the skills that are highly valued for organizations at the end of this talk. But before I get there, I want to talk a bit about AI training, because if you look at the literature that talks about the relationship between artificial intelligence and productivity, it really emphasizes AI training. And we see inside organizations the spend of AI training has increased, but not for everybody. We also see inside organizations, just like U-Turn Industries, that there's a focus on generic training as compared to training that's bespoke to the jobs. And again, we think that's an error. I want to do a comparison, and I can't talk about all groups of employees, but I am going to focus on generations. So it's helpful when I talk to you about the data on generations, if you have in your head which generation are you. And the interesting thing about generations is that it was created in the Pew Center over in the US, artificially constructed. So in some ways it has no meaning, and only 60% of us know what generation they're in. And I can say I was one of the 40% that didn't know until I started working on generations. So inside in the workplace, we have these five generations, generally 4 working together: baby boomers, 1946 to 1964, Generation X, 1965 to 1980, millennials, 1981 to 1996, and Generation Z, 1991 to 2010. And you might think, why is it interesting to think about generations alongside artificial intelligence? Well, the one pattern that we see in organizations over and over again is that they tend to give training to the younger generations, and they're not giving the training to Generation X and baby boomers in the same numbers. Inside in organizations, we know that generations already fuel tensions. So here are some snippets from newspapers that are taken from mainstream media. To my horror, Gen X is turning to voice notes. I don't want to hear your mini podcast. Gen Xers and boomers share things that used to be normal but are boundary crossing today. For people like me inside in organizations, we're interested to see whether or not these stereotypes translate once individuals actually go to work, and the answer seems to be yes. And if we can get generations working better together, we do see productivity gains in organizations. Specific to generation and AI, though, we see this divide. So we have this headline from The Guardian: workers risk being left behind because of AI. And this is the technology secretary really warning that the over 55s aren't getting access to the training that they need. A looming crisis for the experienced, again, thinking about workers who are over 55 mainly, some articles going as low as over 35, talking about that these are skilled and experienced individuals who aren't going to be retained by their organization. And then the third, that younger workers are actually sabotaging AI. So you saw for Hung that some people are actually choosing to go on strike. So nearly 44% of Gen Z admit to actively undermining their employer's AI strategy. And what interests me about this is that we gathered lots of data in generations across the globe, including in the UK. And we were really interested in thinking about how often is it that individuals are asked to have artificial intelligence training. And if you look at the graph and you look at the gray lines, it will replicate exactly what the stereotypes tell you. Gen Z gets offered it more, Gen X and the boomers get offered it less. What the media headlines don't say, because it's not sexy and it's not provocative, that when these individuals have access to training in equal measures, there is no difference in how they use it inside in the workplace. And this is represented by the red bar. And what these headlines definitely don't tell us is that all generations can up their productivity by about twice as much if they get equal access to AI. In contrast, if there's unequal access to artificial intelligence inside in the organization, we don't see these productivity gains. AI also isn't just rewarding the stars. So what's interesting inside in organizations, if we look at the lowest performing workers, they are the ones who are going to gain the most from artificial intelligence being rolled out inside in the organization. So we see here that for the lowest performing workers, they're getting a 27 percentage point increase. So individuals who are highly experienced, highly knowledgeable, will actually have less gains to artificial intelligence than we might otherwise think. So what I want to convince you today is that we should kind of train to redesign work. You heard Hung talking about tasks. What that involves is individuals becoming really familiar with the tasks they're doing on a day-to-day basis, being really clear on what can be handed to artificial intelligence, and being really clear on what should stay with them. And the last part I want to talk to you today is not forgetting the human being. So in the organizations that I've seen who have been transformational, have had growth greater than 5%, have continued to recruit, they haven't forgotten their humans. 44% projected rise in AI spend in 2026, and then we see a drop in the number of hours training being offered to employees from 47 to 40. And bearing in mind that that 40 hours training includes artificial intelligence training. Even more worryingly, soft skills, collaborative leadership, agility, resilience, reduced from 24% to 3%. And these are the skills that we know enable workers to do better in an AI revolution. 60% of AI users got no training to use it well. It basically means that they're self-serving, so inside in the organizations, we're expecting them to do better, to be more productive, but we're not giving them the skills to do just that. One thing to emphasize is we always imagine that every single human being is replaceable by artificial intelligence. And the evidence that we have now tells us two things. Firstly, we can't predict where this trend is going. For the first 6 months of 2025, we know that artificial intelligence augmented jobs inside and professional workplaces. For the second half of 2025, it started to automate them. And now we're here, if we look to the data at the end of June, it's now starting to augment it again. And the only way that we can explain this strategy is because artificial intelligence itself doesn't have a strategy, is that organizations are thinking about bringing their people along versus automating them, and their minds aren't yet made up. The second thing is that there's a number of studies that come out that look to see how artificial intelligence does if the task is hard. And artificial intelligence does two things if the task is hard. First, it performs about 20 percentage points less than humans. But secondly, it's overconfident in its ability, even when the task is incredibly hard. Which means that if I'm working with it, I have a technology telling me an answer with certainty, even though it's lower quality and it's actually getting things wrong. There's three things that artificial intelligence can do, and the organizations that I'm working on are looking at these. The first is questioning the machine. One of the oldest personality traits that has been linked to better labor market outcomes and better career progression is conscientiousness. So these organizations are looking to see how can we test whether or not an individual is conscientious, and they will question the machine rather than expecting what they say as given. The second is decisions under uncertainty. We know from trials that artificial intelligence is incredibly badly with making decisions under uncertainty, and this is where human beings have the edge. Again, here we're talking about agility, learnability, judgment. These are things we can test for when we are recruiting these individuals. And we are testing for them when we are recruiting individuals. The third is creating with others. Am I inclusive? Am I collaborative? Do I understand that if somebody has a different perspective to me, it's going to be useful? Because again, if I'm training my artificial intelligence agent, it's becoming somebody like me. Probably a bit more confident, but still somebody like me. So when no one questions the machine, it costs money. So we heard Hong talk about the errors that Deloitte made, but it goes beyond that. 15 fake citations and 9 invented quotes by a US attorney who was fined $10,000, and when he was asked to verify them, he turned to Google to find the verification. 4.4 million average loss per incident, with 44% of organizations saying that they have made big mistakes because of artificial intelligence. Who can stop the artificial intelligence making mistakes? The human beings. What should we be teaching them, training them, upskilling them for? Conscientiousness, agility, judgment, inclusive leadership, and being able to make decisions under uncertainty. When we think about the machine, there's 3 things that it does that we would wish as human beings that we didn't do. So the first is overconfidence. There's a huge literature that tells us when human beings are overconfident, you can think about the most overconfident person that you know, that they tend to present information to us as if it were fact. The artificial intelligence is doing that. It's not helpful. We need to push back. The second is realizing verification is a skill. The artificial intelligence agent doesn't have it. And in fact, in some trials, when people push back on the artificial intelligence, it dug itself more into a hole. Or when they pushed back on the artificial intelligence, they took the answer that they were given by that person as for granted. So again, there's limits to what the machine can do. And the last part is that it's really important that accountability says human. I went to a presentation recently by an organization who create driverless trucks. And they said to me that they're going to have driverless trucks on the London within 3 years. And I said to them, I would be very surprised if you have driverless trucks on the London within 3 years, because there's laws. And I can't imagine within 3 years that the Mayor of London would have relaxed to allow driverless trucks on our road. And the reason for that is that we need accountability. And having that driver behind the wheel gives the accountability. Insurance companies don't need to price it. Inside an organization's risk, albeit we don't necessarily need to have insurance, we want to have human beings being accountable if something goes wrong. 3 things I think about that are really important when it comes to recruitment. When it comes to the ideal candidate, we no longer want the largest CV. We want to look for conscientiousness. We want to look for agility. We want to look for resilience. These are things we can test for when somebody is coming through our doors. We also want to try to keep the talent that we have. We want to nurture them, give them equal access to training for artificial intelligence that takes away the boring part of their job, let them redesign their jobs, and also give them these skills, conscientiousness, agility, resilience, that we know will future-proof them against artificial intelligence. U-turn industries who've changed their mind, and I'll talk about what they do differently at the end now, are up-tiering from the cutters. So they're looking at their competition, they're looking at organizations who were doing what they were doing last year, and they're poaching their talent. And they're poaching their talent because they recognize that their competitors are defunding human skills, and all of us want to be valued inside an organization. 3 things for behavioral science that you might want to think about when you're hiring: redesigning how you're hiring. At the moment, I'm doing a huge hiring experiment with small to medium enterprises. If anyone is interested, please come and talk to me. It's absolutely free, and we're moving to task-based assessments. So here, individuals, instead of having interviews, they're going to be faced with a task that they will do on the job. And those tasks will capture the skills that we're interested in: conscientiousness, resilience, agility. The second thing is really focus on building the traits in small steps. So inside in organizations, I've shown you that the funding for soft skills has gone to 4% compared to what it was. We want to focus on giving people conscientiousness, giving them agility, and giving them resilience. One of the first things I did when I went to U-Turn Industries is I asked them, could I go through their AI training? And I will tell you very honestly, I had a very complicated root canal, and that was more interesting to me than the AI training that they gave me. We have to take seriously that if we're asking people to do things on their lunch break, we're asking people to do things in their busy schedules, that we make learning fun. So again, what we try to do with behavioral science is think about how can I get somebody to engage in the training that they're actually enjoying it. They can get points, there can be leadership boards, we can gamify things. There's lots of ways in which to make this more exciting, and we really need to do it. And we need to do it for 2 reasons. One, to get the people to do the training, but the second, to make it stick. Experiments tell us that if we gamify training, for example, that individuals are much more likely to remember it 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days later as compared to when we don't. 3 things as well when we think about talent. So the first is, when it comes to artificial intelligence, it's already making our lowest performers equal to the average. So what we want to do is figure out how we can pick out the people who have good judgment, good decision-making skills, good agility, good conscientiousness. This is what's going to help organizations. The second is redesigning roles around human judgment. The CTO, John, who I met in the very beginning, he might sound like a farcical person. This is an extraordinarily intelligent, well-meaning individual who wasn't able to see outside his own domain of expertise. Once he saw what it was doing to talent in the organization, he was really willing to change his strategy. And the first thing that they did was to think about redesigning jobs around human judgment. So what are the jobs that individuals were doing in U-Turn Industries? And we thought about how can we think about tasks that can be inserted into those jobs that can't easily be automated by artificial intelligence. As Hung said in his talk, your job might be called something else, but hopefully it's more enjoyable. And the last is really paying attention to auditing who is in the room before AI scales it. So when John joined U-Turn Industries did what industries often do, is they asked John to bring a team with him. So he assembled a team of individuals he had worked with for years outside that particular company and parachuted them in to come up with the artificial intelligence strategy. They even had a slogan: "Don't build the future, we should automate it." Really great people, really intelligent, but they didn't know what was happening inside in the organization. So we really need to see who's inside in the room. Ideally, it's people who are new to the organization. I spoke to you in the beginning about Priya, fantastic artificial intelligence colleague. We have Priya in the room. Ideally, it's people who've been there a long time, like Marcus, who have legacy. And ideally, it's people like Denise, who are pivotal to the organization, and we want to make sure that they stay on board. So I'm going to go back to U-Turn Industries and say 3 things. Firstly, they're not unusual. There's lots of organizations that are like U-Turn Industries that are focused on cost efficiency over transformation. They're focused on reducing headcount over productivity, and we think this is a mistake. So I know it's a mistake at an industry level because the people who aren't focused on transformation aren't seeing productivity gains, and we know this from the data. But if we think about it from a country level, wouldn't it be wonderful to live in a country where we use artificial intelligence to transform our economy, where we're hiring more people, where we're not overly focused on cost cutting? And I really practice what I preach on this. I only work with organizations who don't have as their main objective that they want to cost cut when it comes to artificial intelligence. When I met them, they were doing 4 things. They were spending on the tool, not on transformation. They had made AI training optional, and the best people had opted out. Denise, you'll remember, had chosen to leave without notice. They had defunded the human skills, and they had forgot about the human entirely. and they had let AI run unchecked, and nobody was questioning the machine. What they do now, 1 year later, is they're redesigning work before they're automating it. They've trained every cohort. They hire for the ceiling, they're focused on conscientiousness, agility, resilience, and they're testing for those things in the tasks and also in the interview. And they're also putting the human in the loop to question the machine. One of the biggest learnings I have from looking at the literature is that things go spectacularly wrong when artificial intelligence is asked a question that they have no previous information on. And we live in a world of great uncertainty, so that's happening more and more. And they're also using behavioral science to get their workers in the new skills that they need. If you're interested in behavioral science, please do look me up. I can send you lots of free resources. There's lots of small things that organizations are doing that I know that work that I'm really happy to share with you as well. The bottom line for my talk, if you take one thing away, transformation is a people problem. It's not a technology problem, and we should be shaping what artificial intelligence is doing inside organizations together. Thank you so much for listening.